He wanted to claim a secret house in the mountains for himself, but he didn't know who built it or why it disappeared. Now he must decide: destroy someone else's work or preserve its mystery. Subscribe. Write in the comments which city you are watching from. The morning light spilled across the small apartment like a hesitant visitor, soft but uninvited. Edward sat by the window, the steam from his coffee fading into the cool air. He had grown used to the silence, not the comfortable kind that fills a home, but the heavy one that lingers after too many goodbyes. On the table before him lay a stack of yellowed blueprints, some marked with fading pencil notes. They were the remnants of his past life, the life of an engineer who once built cities, bridges, and dreams. Now, the lines on paper felt like echoes of a man who no longer existed. He had buried his wife 2 years ago, and with her went the rhythm of his days. The company they built together had folded soon after. Investors pulled out. Projects froze, and his name, once respected, became a whisper among colleagues. For a time, he tried to keep working, but each construction site felt like a graveyard of old ambitions. Eventually, he packed his tools, left the city, and settled in a modest apartment near the mountains. There, he lived quietly, between the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional cry of birds beyond the window. It was in this silence that the idea came, not suddenly, but like a slow breath forming in the back of his mind. He wanted to build again, not for money, not for prestige, but for something simpler. A small mountain lodge, a place where people could come to rest and listen to the earth instead of engines. He imagined a few cabins facing a river, a wooden terrace, rooms filled with warm light and the scent of pine. He told himself that if he could finish this one project, maybe he would finally understand what peace felt like. For months, he searched for the right spot. He drove along winding roads that disappeared into forests, stopped by real estate offices in distant towns, and studied maps marked with faded property lines. Most of the land he visited disappointed him. Too close to highways, too steep, too exposed. The world had become too crowded. Every valley was owned, every quiet place fenced off and measured in square meters. He wanted untouched ground, a space that had forgotten about people. Late one afternoon, after yet another fruitless visit to a noisy valley filled with half-built chalets, he decided to take a detour. The sun was already lowering behind the ridges, painting the rocks in amber light. He parked his truck near a narrow trail and followed a stream that ran parallel to the road. The path was barely visible, swallowed by moss and fallen branches. Each step took him deeper into stillness. The sound of water grew softer, muffled by thick curtains of leaves. He felt the temperature drop as he descended into a shaded hollow where the trees gave way to stone. When he reached the bottom, the forest opened into a small gorge, a hidden corridor carved by the stream over centuries. The water glimmered faintly in the dim light, winding between walls of dark rock. And then he saw it, a circular doorway set directly into the cliffside. It was so perfectly shaped that for a moment he thought it must be a trick of light. The door was wooden, weathered, but intact, framed by stones, cut and fitted with impossible precision. Moss grew between the seams like nature's signature on human craft. Edward stood there for a long while, unable to move. The engineer in him recognized mastery. Whoever built this had known both geometry and patience. He brushed his hand along the cold surface. Smooth, deliberate, solid. The hinges were rusted, but the door held firm. No noise, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been here in years. It looked less like a dwelling and more like a secret, something built to be forgotten. He took a few steps back and surveyed the surroundings. The cliff stretched upward, its face merging with the mist. The stream curved nearby, disappearing into a cluster of rocks. It was an ideal place, secluded, silent, invisible from any road, a perfect foundation for his dream. He imagined cleaning the walls, adding wooden beams, maybe glass panels to open the view of the river. The thought excited him. It felt like destiny had led him here. That night, he couldn't sleep. His mind replayed every detail: the symmetry of the stonework, the cool scent of moss, the faint echo of water inside the cave. At dawn, he drove back to the nearest town and went straight to the municipal office. The clerk on duty was an older man with tired eyes. Edward spread his photographs on the counter and asked about the structure. The man adjusted his glasses and frowned. "There's no record of anything built in that area," he said, after checking the archives. "No permits, no ownership claims, nothing. According to our maps, that slope is natural rock," Edward insisted. He described the doorway, the craftsmanship, the clear signs of construction. The clerk only shrugged. "Then someone built it illegally, a long time ago. If no one has claimed it, it's just rock now. But be careful. The mountain doesn't like to be disturbed." He left with more questions than answers, yet a strange exhilaration followed him. He had stumbled upon something no one else knew existed. It wasn't just land, it was a discovery. He began sketching ideas that same evening, redrawing the structure from memory, tracing where walls could be reinforced and where new space could open. By midnight, the sketches filled his desk. He decided to submit a request for restoration rights. If the site was unregistered, it could become his legally. Days turned into weeks as he gathered the necessary documents. His old colleagues, still holding him in some respect, helped him navigate the bureaucracy. He described the project as heritage reconstruction, a way to preserve an unknown mountain dwelling. Officials liked the idea. It sounded cultural, not commercial. The process advanced faster than he expected. Soon, he received a preliminary approval letter. All he needed was a final inspection and signature. When he returned to the gorge, the air felt different. The sound of the river seemed louder, as if warning him. He approached the doorway, half expecting to find everything as he left it. But the ground bore fresh marks, footprints, small but deep in the damp soil. Nearby, a neat pile of firewood rested under a rock ledge. The wood was new, cut evenly, arranged with care. Inside the stone chamber, the floor was swept clean. The air smelled faintly of smoke and herbs. He froze. Someone was living here. He stepped back quietly, heart racing. For a moment he considered calling out, but instinct told him not to. Whoever had built this might still be around, and the place was too remote for chance encounters. He looked around. Nothing moved, only the soft ripple of the stream. The forest pressed close, listening. Edward left slowly, promising himself he would return. That night, the thought of the unknown inhabitant kept him awake. It wasn't fear, exactly, but an unease mixed with fascination. He had come looking for solitude, and now it seemed solitude was already claimed. Still, he couldn't let go. The next morning, he loaded his truck with tools and supplies, telling himself he just wanted to take measurements to confirm the structure's safety before any formal work began. Yet deep down, he knew he wanted to understand who had created such a place and why they had hidden it from the world. The journey back up the mountain felt heavier. Clouds rolled in, wrapping the peaks in silver haze. The road was slick from recent rain, the air thick with the scent of wet pine. When he reached the trailhead, he parked and listened. The only sound was water running far below. He followed the path cautiously, every step sinking into the moss. At the mouth of the gorge, the doorway waited, unchanged, ancient, and alive. He stood there, feeling both awe and trespass. A faint current of wind slipped through the crack in the door, carrying the smell of smoke, not from long ago, but recent, unmistakably human. He hesitated, his hand hovering near the handle. Somewhere beyond that wooden door was the line between curiosity and intrusion. And yet, as the clouds gathered and the river whispered behind him, he knew he would cross it. Not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but soon. He turned away and began the climb back up the hill, unaware that from the shadows of the rocks, someone was watching him leave. The gorge swallowed his footsteps, and the door, half hidden by vines, kept its quiet secret for another day. That night, as rain drummed softly against his window, Edward sat by the desk and stared at the blueprints once more. His pen hovered over the page, tracing the outline of the mysterious circle. A thought came to him, clear, unsettling, and irresistible. He would not just rebuild what he had found, he would uncover the story of the one who built it. And so, without knowing it, the man who came to the mountains to build for others had begun building something else. A path that would lead him deep into another man's silence. The days that followed blurred into a slow rhythm of returning, observing, and waiting. Edward could not keep away from the valley. Every time he descended into the narrow gorge, he told himself it would be the last visit before the legal inspection. Yet the moment his boots touched the moss-covered stones, a calmness settled over him that he could not find anywhere else. The air there was different, sharper, cleaner, filled with a whispering energy that made him feel both intruder and guest. Each return revealed small changes that he couldn't explain. Leaves cleared from the entrance, a pile of wood shifted, the faint trace of ashes near the stream. Someone was there. Someone who moved with the quiet confidence of belonging. He began to leave small offerings at the doorway, unsure whether out of caution or respect. A loaf of bread one morning, a tin of tea on another. The gifts would vanish by the time he returned, but there was never a note, never a sign of acknowledgement. It became their unspoken dialogue, the silence between two people who hadn't yet met, each measuring the other's presence through absence. Sometimes, standing by the water, Edward imagined the unseen resident watching from the shadows. He wondered who he was, how long he had lived there, and whether the world had simply forgotten him, or he had chosen to forget the world. The mountain began to change as spring deepened. The river ran fuller, carrying melted snow from the peaks, and the air smelled of earth waking from sleep. On one of those warmer mornings, Edward arrived earlier than usual. The mist still hovered low, and when he reached the bottom of the slope, the sunlight was just beginning to filter through the pines. He saw smoke, a thin, steady column rising from behind the rocks near the entrance. His heartbeat quickened. He followed the trail of scent until he saw him. The man sat beside the stream, his back slightly bent, a fishing line between his fingers. His clothes were worn but clean. A wool sweater, boots that looked repaired many times, and a thick jacket with patches of faded color. His hair was white, his beard short, and his hands, strong, precise, the kind that had known both creation and labor. Edward froze, afraid to disturb the fragile stillness. The man must have sensed him, for he turned his head slightly, eyes sharp but calm. There was no surprise in them, only quiet acknowledgement, as though he had been expecting this moment all along. "Good morning," Edward said softly. The stranger nodded without looking away from the water. "You've been coming here for weeks," the old man said after a pause. His voice carried the texture of gravel, rough but steady. "I thought you might finally say something." Edward hesitated, unsure what to confess. "I didn't mean to intrude. I found this place by accident. It's extraordinary. I wanted to know who built it." "I did," the man replied simply, reeling in his line and examining the small silver fish wriggling on the hook. He freed it gently and let it slide back into the stream. A long time ago. There was no pride in his tone, no claim of ownership, just a statement of fact. Edward stepped closer, drawn by a strange mixture of curiosity and reverence. "You built it alone?" he asked. The old man nodded, his gaze following the water downstream. "After the collapse," he said quietly, "there was a tunnel, one of the big ones they were drilling under the ridge. It gave way. 12 men didn't come out." He paused, his eyes unfocused. "I was the engineer. I thought I knew the mountain. I didn't." Edward felt the weight of those words settle over them. The air thickened, heavy with memory. "So you came here," he said gently. The man gave a slow nod. "I came here because I couldn't stand the sound of engines anymore. I carved the first room with a hammer and chisel. Then I kept digging, adding stone by stone, until it felt like the mountain had taken me back. I built it not to live, but to disappear." The simplicity of his confession struck Edward harder than any dramatic tale could have. Here was a man who had turned his punishment into creation, who had shaped his guilt into shelter. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the soft murmur of the stream. Edward wanted to ask more, but the quiet between them felt sacred, not to be broken with too many words. After that day, their meetings became routine. Edward would come in the early mornings, sometimes bringing bread or coffee, sometimes just himself. The old man, Thomas, as he later introduced himself, never seemed surprised to see him. They spoke little, and yet each silence was filled with meaning. Thomas showed him the workings of the stone dwelling, how the ventilation shafts were angled to carry smoke out and fresh air in, how the channel from the stream brought water through the walls without flooding, how each curve of the structure followed the natural shape of the rock. Edward marveled at the precision. No machines, no power tools, just patience and understanding. "You built it like an engineer," he said once. Thomas smiled faintly. "I built it like a man who had nothing left to lose." Over time, Edward began to see how different they were, and yet how deeply their paths intertwined. He had come to the mountains chasing purpose, searching for something to build. Thomas had built his way into solitude to bury the very same urge. The mountain, it seemed, had given them each what the other lacked. Back in the city, the reconstruction permit was moving forward. His old colleagues congratulated him. "You'll make history with this one of them said over the phone. "A hidden mountain lodge. It's genius." Edward mumbled something polite, but the words left a bitter taste. Each approval letter felt heavier, not lighter. The closer he came to owning the site, the less it felt right to touch it. He started avoiding the officials' calls, spending more time with Thomas instead. One evening, as they sat by the fire near the stream, Thomas spoke again, his voice carrying through the hum of insects. "You're an engineer, too," he said. Edward nodded. "I was. I stopped after everything changed. I thought I'd build something that mattered again." Thomas looked at him for a long moment. "And what makes it matter?" Edward didn't have an answer. He stared into the flames, watching them twist around the wood. "Maybe if it helps people," he said at last. "If it gives them peace." The old man smiled faintly. "Peace isn't something you can build for others. It's something you stop disturbing in yourself." The words lingered long after Edward returned home. That night, he opened the folder of official documents and read through the lines. Permits, coordinates, legal terms. They looked sterile, soulless. He imagined construction crews coming into the valley, machines tearing through the moss, noise echoing off the rocks. The thought sickened him. He closed the folder and pushed it aside. For days he avoided the mountain, trying to let the decision settle. Yet every sound of city life, the passing trucks, the hammering from a nearby renovation, made him long for the quiet of the gorge. When he finally returned, the path felt like an old road back to truth. Thomas was outside, splitting wood. He didn't look up as Edward approached. "You stopped coming," the old man said without turning. Edward nodded. "I needed to think." "And?" Thomas asked, setting another log on the stump. "I can't do it," Edward said simply. "I can't take what's yours. The papers are ready. The inspectors are waiting. But if I sign, I'll destroy what makes this place alive." Thomas finally looked at him, the faintest flicker of surprise in his eyes. Then he nodded, slow and approving. "Good. You learned faster than I did." Edward exhaled, a mix of relief and uncertainty flooding him. "But what should I do now? I came here to build something. I thought that would fix me." "Then build," Thomas said. "But build what is yours, not what already belongs to the silence." He placed a hand on the stone wall beside him, fingers brushing the cold surface, as though touching an old friend. "If you remember how this place feels, you'll know what to make." The conversation ended there. They shared a quiet meal, the way they often did, and when Edward left, the sun was setting behind the peaks, staining the valley in gold. He climbed slowly, turning back once to see the faint glow of fire through the cracks in the rock. The sight filled him with both sorrow and strength. That night, he didn't open the folder again. Instead, he spread blank sheets of paper across his desk and began sketching anew. The lines came easily, flowing with instinct rather than calculation. He no longer thought of walls and profits, but of shapes that breathed, rooms that listened, spaces that welcomed the light instead of trapping it. He realized that building was not about control. It was about understanding when to stop shaping and start letting the earth speak. Weeks passed, and the paperwork expired quietly without renewal. No one called. No one asked. The world, busy with its noise, forgot about the little valley. But Edward could not forget. Each visit now felt like a pilgrimage, each stone carrying meaning. He sometimes found small changes, a newly placed rock, a repaired crack, a stack of dried herbs tied with string. Thomas was still there, still tending to his invisible home, and Edward never questioned how he lived or what he ate. It no longer mattered. The last time they spoke before the next winter, the air was cold enough to make the stream crust over with ice. Edward found Thomas sitting outside, watching the frost spread along the rocks. They didn't exchange greetings. The silence between them was enough. After a while, Thomas said quietly, "The mountain keeps what it needs. The rest of us are only passing through." Edward nodded. He wanted to ask if Thomas ever regretted anything. The tunnel, the years of solitude. But he didn't. The answer was already in the man's eyes. Regret and peace had long learned to live side by side. When Edward left that evening, snow began to fall, light and slow, covering his footprints behind him. The valley faded into white mist. He didn't know it then, but that would be the last time he saw Thomas that season. In the months that followed, as winter deepened, Edward began to draw in earnest. What emerged on paper was not a replica of the stone dwelling, but its echo, something inspired by it, yet entirely his own. The sketches showed walls carved into the slope, beams growing out of rock, rooms filled with soft light, water running beneath the floor. It was less a building and more an idea, a place that breathed with the mountain rather than stood against it. He worked in silence, the same kind that had once frightened him, but now felt like guidance. Outside, snow piled against the windows. Inside, the fire crackled, and in that rhythm of flame and pencil, Edward understood that he had found what he came to the mountains for. Not a project, but a direction. And somewhere far away, in the valley that no map acknowledged, a thin thread of smoke still rose from the stone doorway, curling through the white air, as if to say that the mountain remembered both the man who stayed and the one who finally learned how to leave. Winter passed slowly, as if time itself had thickened with the cold. The mountains turned white, the trees stood heavy with frost, and the world around Edward seemed to fall into a hush that was both oppressive and comforting. Each morning he rose early, lit the fire, and sat at his drafting table until the faint glow of dawn touched the paper. The drawings of his new lodge grew in detail day by day, lines merging into forms, walls breathing into shape. He no longer designed with rulers and calculations. Instead, he worked by intuition, guided by something softer, an understanding born not from textbooks, but from silence. The memory of the stone dwelling in the valley remained with him constantly. He could still hear the murmur of the stream that flowed past Thomas's door, the sound of water slipping through moss and stone. Sometimes, while sketching, he would look up and imagine the old man sitting there, his back bent slightly, his face turned toward the light filtering through the gorge. The image filled him with both warmth and melancholy. He wondered if Thomas had survived the winter. The valley was remote and unforgiving. Snow must have sealed the path long ago. Perhaps the old man had found his peace at last, buried within the mountain he had chosen as his refuge. By the time the first patches of grass appeared on the slopes, Edward's plans were complete. He sold the last of his city property and used the money to buy a stretch of land higher up the same range. It wasn't far from the hidden gorge, but distant enough that he could build without disturbing it. Standing on that new site for the first time, he felt something settle inside him, a quiet certainty that he was finally doing the right thing. The air was thin and clear, scented with resin and cold water. Below him stretched a valley where fog drifted lazily over the trees. It was exactly as he had imagined his lodge to be, not dominating the mountain, but belonging to it. He began the construction slowly, choosing to do much of the work himself. The rhythm of manual labor gave his days purpose. He laid stones by hand, aligned timber beams, and shaped each surface to follow the land's natural curves. He was no longer trying to prove anything to anyone. He wasn't building for clients, investors, or tourists. He was building for the silence that had once frightened him, and for the voice it carried within it. When workers came to help, he spoke little, but worked alongside them, showing through gestures how he wanted things done. He told them not to cut trees unnecessarily, to use fallen trunks for firewood, to leave the wildflowers untouched. At first, they didn't understand his restraint. Why build so carefully when it would be easier to flatten the ground and start from scratch? But over time, they began to sense his intention. The project became something more than a job. Evenings often ended with the men sitting around the fire outside, listening to the distant call of owls, and one by one they started to share small moments of silence with him, as though the mountain had begun to teach them too. Edward rarely went to the gorge during that period, but it never left his mind. Occasionally, as dusk fell, he would climb a nearby ridge and look down toward the hidden valley, hoping to see a wisp of smoke. Most nights, he saw nothing. Once, however, on a still evening near midsummer, he caught sight of a faint line of gray rising through the trees. The sight filled him with quiet relief. Thomas was alive. It was enough to know he was still there, that the old man's solitude remained untouched. Months passed, and the lodge slowly took shape. The first room he finished was the main hall, a wide-open space with a wall of windows facing the river below. He built it from rough timber, leaving the grain visible, the imperfections intact. He wanted the structure to breathe. The water from the stream was diverted into a narrow channel that ran under the floor, its quiet trickle constant, a living heartbeat within the walls. The light inside changed with the hours. Pale gold in the morning, copper in the afternoon, deep blue by evening. Sometimes he would stop working just to stand there, hands dusty, listening to the sound of wind through the rafters. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt full, as if the mountain had accepted him. When the lodge was finally ready, he didn't celebrate. There were no opening parties, no advertisements. He simply opened the doors and waited. Travelers began to arrive, little by little hikers, following rumors of a quiet refuge in the mountains, wanderers who had grown tired of the noise of cities. They came expecting a hotel and found something else entirely. The place had no reception desk, no music, no television. There were only a few rooms, each with a window that opened toward the forest. At night, the guests sat by the fire, speaking in low voices or not speaking at all. Some stayed for a day, others for weeks. Many left behind letters or drawings, thanking him for a peace they couldn't quite describe. Edward read them with a quiet satisfaction. He understood what they meant because he had felt the same. One autumn evening, when the leaves had turned to gold and red, Edward decided to visit the gorge again. It had been more than a year since he had last seen Thomas. The path was overgrown, but his steps found it easily, guided by memory. The valley looked unchanged, though the air carried a deeper chill. As he approached the stone doorway, he noticed the same circular entrance, moss now thick over the stones, but the door slightly ajar. He called out softly, "Thomas?" No answer came. Inside, the air was still. The small fire pit was cold. A cup sat on the table, a thin layer of dust coating its rim. He took a step closer, and his eyes caught something carved into the wooden surface. A small figure, the outline of a mountain, and beneath it, two shapes that might have been hands. It was simple, almost childlike, yet unmistakably deliberate. Next to it lay a piece of wood, carefully polished, engraved with lines resembling the pattern of the lodge Edward had built. He stood in silence for a long while. There was no body, no sign of departure, but he understood. The mountain had taken Thomas back, just as he had said it would. Edward placed his hand on the cold stone wall, feeling the texture beneath his palm. "Thank you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure whom he was addressing. The man, the mountain, or both. He left the carvings untouched and stepped outside. The air was sharp and clean, the stream running steady as ever. He picked up a smooth stone from the riverbank and placed it at the door, a small gesture of remembrance. When he returned to his lodge, it was dusk. The sky glowed orange over the peaks. He stood on the terrace, watching the last light fade behind the ridge. Somewhere in that endless stretch of rock and forest was the valley that had changed everything. He felt no sadness, only gratitude. Thomas's words echoed in his mind. "If you remember how this place feels, you'll know what to make." Now he understood fully. Over the following weeks, guests continued to come. They asked him about the design, the unusual harmony between the building and its surroundings. Some even wondered if he had found inspiration from older mountain dwellings, ancient structures no longer on maps. He would smile and answer only, "It's built where silence wanted it." Those who stayed long enough began to sense what he meant. The place didn't impress, it absorbed. People arrived carrying noise within them, and when they left, they did so quietly, as if unwilling to disturb the air. As winter returned, Edward often sat by the fire alone after the guests had gone to bed. The logs cracked softly, sending sparks into the air. Through the large window, he could see snow beginning to fall, slow and gentle. He thought about Thomas then, the man who had built to disappear, and realized that his own work was, in some way, the continuation of that story. Thomas had carved himself into the mountain. Edward had learned to listen to it. The two of them, separated by years and choices, had built different answers to the same question: how to live with what cannot be undone. One evening, as he prepared to close for the season, he felt compelled to take a walk. He left the fire burning low and stepped outside. The snow was ankle-deep, the air so still it seemed the world had stopped breathing. He walked toward the edge of the ridge where the path began its descent into the valley below. From there he could see only the faint outline of the gorge, a shadow among shadows. For a moment, he thought he saw a thin line of smoke drifting upward, but when he blinked, it was gone. He smiled. Maybe it was only the mist. Maybe it was something else. Either way, he took it as a sign that nothing built with love ever truly disappears. As he turned to go back inside, the first gust of wind swept across the slope, carrying the faint scent of pine and water. The lodge behind him glowed warmly against the snow, a pulse of life in the cold expanse. He paused, looking at what he had created, not with pride, but with peace. It wasn't just a building. It was a conversation continued, a promise kept. The mountain had given him its silence, and he had given it a home. In the months and years that followed, the lodge remained small and quiet. Edward never expanded it, never advertised it. Those who found it did so by chance, guided by rumor or intuition. They came weary. They left lighter. He grew older, his hair silvering like the frost that crept over the beams each winter. But the work never ended. He repaired, replanted, and listened to the wind, to the water, to the ghosts of the valley that had once taught him humility. And sometimes, on clear nights, when the stars hung low and the river below caught their reflection, he would whisper softly into the dark, as if speaking to an unseen friend. "You were right, Thomas. We both built the same thing." Then he would close his eyes and listen, and for a brief moment, he could almost hear an answer, a faint breath of wind through the pines, carrying the calm murmur of the stream that had begun it all. The lodge stood there for many years, weathering storms and seasons, its wooden walls darkening with age, its stones settling deeper into the earth. Travelers continued to come, drawn not by signs or advertisements, but by something they couldn't name. Some said it was the tranquility, others the view. But those who truly listened understood that the mountain itself was alive, and that the man who tended its house was merely its keeper. Edward never denied it. He had long since stopped trying to claim ownership over what the earth had given him. He was only the builder who stayed to listen. And deep within the hidden valley, where moss grew thick on the stones and the stream still sang its quiet song, the house in the rock remained untouched. Its door stood closed, its fire pit empty. But sometimes, when the wind turned a certain way, the sound of soft hammering could still be heard from within the cliffs, as if the mountain remembered the hands that once shaped it. Edward never tried to explain it. Some silences, he knew, were not meant to be broken. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Watch the next video waiting for you right now, and share this story with someone who still believes that every place holds a secret worth remembering.